My name is Paddy. I studied the European wills during this course and will be talking about the animal welfare. Hope yous enjoy. 5 freedoms. The 5 freedoms were invented by the FAWC, also known as Farm Animal Welfare Council. The 5 freedoms were invented to make sure all animals felt safe in the wild and captivity, and to prevent any unwanted behaviours. The 5 freedoms are freedom from hunger and thirst. All animals should be made sure they have a feeding pattern. This should be a daily occurrence or several times a week, depending on the animal. Another freedom is freedom from discomfort. All animals kept in captivity should have an appropriate enclosure to make sure they feel comfortable. Another freedom is freedom from pain, injury, or disease. This should come down to the quality of the animal's enclosure, making sure there is nothing in the enclosure that can hurt the animal in any way. The enclosure should get a daily inspection to prevent this freedom from not happening. And finally, freedom to express normal behaviours. Their enclosure should replicate what they would have lived in the wild. They should be given enough enrichment to keep the animals stimulated and preventing them from any unwanted behaviours. These 5 freedoms should occur to all animals as if they weren't being used. All animals would become stressed and it can cause the animals to even die. The 5 freedoms is built from the current legislation. The legislation relevant to the zoos are the Zoo Licensing Act 1981. This legislation involves allowing inspection and licensing of all zoos in Great Britain. This legislation makes sure that all animals in zoos have got a suitable environment so they can express their normal behaviours. Another legislation is the Animal Welfare Act 2006. This legislation protects the welfare of the individual animal. These legislations should involve around all zoos in Great Britain. There is a lot of charities that govern zoos in the UK, 2 of them being BIAZA and ZSL. BIAZA, also known as the British and the Irish Association of Zoos and Aquariums, is a professional body that represents the greatest zoos in the UK. ZSL, also known as Zoological Society of London, is a charity to the worldwide of the animals and their habitats.
Just watch out where you're going. Oh no. Oh no. Just stay next to the next to Phil. You see next to Phil, my friend?
Yep.
One lot here, yeah?
Yeah.
And then one lot over that end.
Like near like one of the logs at the end.
Right, okay.
So,
Act of a zookeeper. Zookeepers need to do many tasks daily to ensure all animals kept in captivity are maintaining all the 5 freedoms. Daily, a zookeeper needs to ensure the animals that they work with are fed. They do this by going off a data board showing what animals need fed and what ones don't. They need to make sure their enclosure is clean. They do this by going in the enclosure daily and cleaning the animal's feces and cleaning any leftover carcasses that haven't been used. They need to make sure the diet preparation room is all sorted, making sure the food is stored correctly in the separate containers for each animal to prevent any risks of transmitting diseases. They also need to make sure that the animals that are being fed have their food prepped for the time the animals normally get fed. They need to make sure that they observe their animals several times a day, as they need to observe their behaviours and any stereotypical behaviours the animals have been doing. They normally do this by keeping a record sheet on each animal. The main record keeping system that zoos use is ARCS. It's an electronic system which is used to record and store animals' data. The record provides an ever-expanding source of data and information upon which to base husbandry, health, breeding, conservation and collection planning decisions. The way you could tell if welfare standards were being met would be by seeing the animals all look like they are inhibiting their natural behaviours. Seeing their enclosure is clean and pain-free, and knowing they have been fed by the look of the animal and if they have food already in their enclosure. Feeding. In the wild, European wolves hunt in a pack for their food. They would normally hunt wild boar, roe deer, and moose and feast on their carcass. European wolves can eat up to 10 pounds of meat per day, but can go several days without feasting and then eventually feast on a 20-pound chunk of meat. The way European wolves obtain their food is by chasing and testing their prey. They would work as a team in a pack of 7 to 10 wolves to take down their prey from different angles. They would normally have the strongest wolf attack the front of their prey and the weakest at the back and the corner of them. By doing this, it makes it easier to take down for the wolves and make it a success for the wolves and making the feast more rewarding for them. In captivity, European wolves have their food presented by the keepers of Camperdam Zoo by putting a remainder of a carcass in their enclosure and sometimes parts of meat buried under their mud in different sections of their enclosure to make the wolves work for their food and make them use their sense of smell to dig it up. This makes it more rewarding for the wolves. The wolf pack consists of one alpha, normally the oldest wolf. During their feeding time, all the wolves would wait on the alpha wolf to take the first bite of the carcass. The only way the wolves would get the first bite if they were injured. If any of the wolves fail to let the alpha wolf eat first, then it involves in a fight, which makes the wolves leave the food for the alpha. After the alpha has had its fair feast on the carcass, then the other wolf will fight for the next feast until all of them have been fed. The wolf gets fed 3 times a week, as they get given a big enough carcass which they all get a fair share of until they are fed again. The carcass has to be presented in a specific way, as the wolves are neophobic, meaning they are scared of new things that come into their enclosure. When the zookeepers enter the enclosure, the wolves know they are being fed, so they tend to run and hide and keep a fair distance between the keepers. The keepers will place the carcass in random spots of their enclosure, making the wolves scavenge for their food. Once the keepers have left the enclosure, the wolves will start to sniff the meats out but won't touch them until the alpha has had the first bite. Uncategorized behaviors. Carnivore. For the carnivore, I chose European wolves. The most noticeable stereotypical behavior would be their pacing around their enclosure. This will occur because of their neophobia, scared of new things. The cause of them pacing will be people walking around by their enclosure, watching them, making them feel curious on why they are being watched. Another thing that will cause their pacing is new things being introduced to the enclosure, like a new enrichment idea. Due to their neophobia, it can sometimes take the wolves weeks before encountering the new enrichment in their enclosure. So this will normally pace around the enrichment to investigate before interacting with it. Herbivore. For the herbivore, I decided to do the giraffes. The most common stereotypical behavior you would see in a giraffe would be licking non-food items, like a fence or a pole. This behavior occurs because of an inability of highly motivated feeding behavior patterns. This behavior can only be prevented if the giraffe's feeding pattern is kept to its usual standards and not being changed daily. Omnivore. For the omnivore, I decided to do the ring-tailed lemurs. The most common stereotypical behavior you would normally see in a ring-tailed lemur would normally be over-grooming. This behavior will only occur if the lemurs feel unsafe or isn't displaying any of the 5 freedoms. The way keepers can prevent this from happening is by making sure they are maintaining the 5 freedom rule and have plenty enrichment in their enclosure to keep the lemurs stimulated. Enrichment. Me and my group found it very challenging to find an appropriate enrichment for the European wolves. We found it so challenging because the wolves' neophobia, as if we went for a big enrichment, it could possibly take them weeks to interact with the enrichment, or they might not even go near it, causing more stress on them. The enrichment choice took weeks of researching and planning to finally agree on the idea together. We came up with many ideas beforehand, but none of them we thought the wolves would interact with. The finalized enrichment idea that we ended up progressing on was to make multiple leaf piles in the wolves' enclosure and hide carcasses in them to make the wolves scavenge for their food. The way we decided to do this enrichment idea was by gathering leaves from another animal's enclosure, so at the end we decided to gather leaves from the goat's enclosure. The reason for this is because the leaves would be scent marked by the goat, meaning we had more chance for the wolves to interact with the pile of leaves. Then once we had that all sorted, we then needed to ask the keepers if it was okay for the wolf carcass to be put in the leaf piles for our enrichment. The keepers agreed with us and gave us time to do it. When coming to actually doing the enrichment, we got permission by the keepers to allow us to enter the goat's enclosure for the leaves. We managed to gather 3 bags of leaves to make 2 big leaf piles. Once we had the leaves, we had to then help the keeper cut up a cow carcass to be put in the leaves. At first, I wasn't keen on doing this, but at the end, it wasn't so bad. Once we had the carcass all cut up, me and my group had to load the carcass bucket on the truck and then make our way to the wolf enclosure. Before going in the enclosure, we got told to stay beside the keepers and not to split up, as it can make the wolves more curious and feel like they are being cornered. Once we were in the enclosure, we made our 2 leaf piles, one by their climbing frame and one by their main tree at the bottom of their enclosure. After the leaf piles were made, me and our group left the enclosure, allowing the keepers to put the carcasses in. Once the keepers left the enclosure, it took the wolves 15 minutes to go near the leaves. But eventually, one wolf grabbed part of a carcass out of the leaf pile, making our enrichment product a success. I felt so relieved when they interacted, as I didn't think that they were going to go near the leaves, as it was taking them a while to interact with them. Altogether, the enrichment turned out well for me and my group, and for the wolves, as they had to use their sense of smell and scavenging skills to find the carcass. Ethogram and welfare sheet. This welfare sheet I recorded was after the enrichment was put into the enclosure. Altogether, the welfare standards in Camperdown Zoo were to a great standard for the wolves. Their natural diet is all kept to a record sheet in the zoo, meaning the wolves are on a schedule for being fed. The wolves are part of the parkside vets, so when they are injured or don't look 100%, then they have a veterinary care provided. They have a good supply of water, which is kept by the bottom of their enclosure. It is stored in a big container filled with fresh water every day. The wolves have had plenty hideouts in their enclosure. They have plenty trees and long nettles to hide behind if they feel uncomfortable in any way. They have a big climbing frame, which is good for them to play on and to watch out as they are on higher up. This will help them exhibit their natural behaviours as they would stay on high ground so they can look for predators or prey. The wolves' enclosure is large and spacious, which is good for them, as wolves in a pack of 5 need to have a spacious enclosure to be able to move around and express their natural behaviours. The ethograms that I will be discussing are one before enrichment and one after enrichment. Starting with the one before enrichment, before they had any enrichment in their enclosure, the wolves would normally sit and do nothing until they were being fed. The ethograms that was taken was during a feed. That's the reason there were snarls and wolves being defensive. The wolves only snarl at each other when there is food about, as they normally fight for the carcass. They only tend to fight and show aggression when feeding time, as if they weren't being fed. They would just sit in calmly until they were. The wolves would also be very sociable during a feed, as they all hang around one carcass, as the alpha tends to have the other one. The ethogram after enrichment has some similarities to the other before enrichment. Some similarities being that they are aggressive and showing signs of defensiveness. This is because the enrichment project we chose involved. The only things that seemed to change during the after enrichment was that the wolves would be less sociable. This is because the food was scattered all around their enclosure, meaning that one wolf would go to each carcass, splitting the wolves up. The enrichment product turned out very well, and hopefully Camperdown will keep the enrichment idea going. Thank you for listening and watching my documentary. Hope you enjoyed and learned new things about animal welfare.